Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, Garrett gives us a primer on the First Amendment's right to freedom of the press and why President Donald Trump's attacks on the press are unconstitutional. Hey, Garrett, it's great to see you.
It's good to be back.
So, the impetus for this episode is the rising number of attacks by Donald Trump and his administration on the First Amendment right to freedom of the press. There have been an absurd number of examples in recent days, but just to cite one of the more infamous episodes, Trump banned the Associated Press from White House briefings because it wouldn't call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, as Trump had decreed. So, a lot of people suspect that this is actually unconstitutional, but the purpose of this episode is to be really clear about exactly why. And Garrett, that's what you're going to help us with. Let's first start with a quick history lesson of all the rights enshrined in the Constitution's Bill of Rights. Freedom of the press was something that the founders felt was especially important. Why did the founders feel this way?
Well, James Madison, who was the chief architect of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, called press freedom one of the great bulwarks of liberty, meaning it was an independent source of critique and check on government. And Thomas Jefferson, his friend and fellow Virginian, went further than that and said in a famous quote, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate to prefer the latter. Now, Trump seems to think that we can have government without newspapers. Jefferson would disagree. And that's why this struggle feels really important. And as early as 1790, when the Bill of Rights was adopted, the idea of freedom of the press was powerful. It was central, as you can see from those quotes. And since then, it has grown and changed and become more powerful. In a way, it's changed more than most other values enshrined in the Constitution.
Talk a little bit more about what that original conception of freedom of the press was. You mentioned that it's changed over the years, and how has it evolved?
Well, at the time the First Amendment was framed, the core of the freedom of the press, as they called it, was considered to be the idea of prior restraint. Now, what is prior restraint? This is an important term for people to understand who want to follow press freedom debates even today. A prior restraint is any system of censorship or licensing or advance review where the government will not allow individuals to speak or publish until they get approval from a government official. Right, the classic thing is the censor. That term comes from English law. It goes back at least to the 18th century, and the idea has developed that the First Amendment is an almost complete bar against prior restraint. And even in the 1970s, when the United States was engaged in military conflict in Southeast Asia, major newspapers printed the top secret Pentagon Papers, which was a discussion of the war's history and strategy that was classified top secret. And when the government asked the Supreme Court to bar this publication, the court said no, not even national security is a good enough reason to justify a prior restraint.
So if I understand this right, though, prior restraint simply means that the government can't censor something beforehand, before the fact, but it doesn't necessarily protect outlets from punishment after the fact, right?
That's exactly right. And that's exactly what happened 7 years after the First Amendment was adopted. And this is another key term about press freedom that people should know. And that term is called seditious libel. In 1798, President John Adams's Federalist Party was pretty much facing electoral wipeout in the 1800 election. Everyone saw this coming. Adams was very unpopular, even in his own party. But a lot of Federalists thought that his prospective opponent, Thomas Jefferson, was really a kind of antichrist who was going to destroy all the churches and do away with states and introduce a kind of French Revolution style reign of terror. So Congress framed a law called the Sedition Act, which forbade false criticisms of government. It made it a crime to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writings against either House of Congress of the United States or the President with intent to bring them into contempt or disrepute. That pretty much outlawed any criticism of John Adams. And during the run up to the election, federal prosecutors enthusiastically used that law to jail newspaper editors who criticized the administration, and even one member of Congress who criticized Adams. They even ended up prosecuting a drunk in a bar in Philadelphia who made a joke about Adams's weight. So you can see that in terms of what we understand as freedom of the press today, the concept wasn't very well developed. However, what happened is that the act politically backfired spectacularly. The popular backlash propelled Jefferson and his party into power with unbeatable majorities. And the new president immediately pardoned everyone who had been jailed under the Sedition Act. The act expired in 1801. Okay, so the Supreme Court never actually ruled on its constitutionality. But 2 centuries later, in 1964, the Supreme Court, in a case called New York Times versus Sullivan, declared that the attack upon the idea of seditious libel has carried the day in the court of history. And in Sullivan, the court developed a doctrine of actual malice. Now, that's the third press freedom term that we need to learn today. Actual malice means that a public official, say the president or the local chief of police, or a public figure ranging from P. Diddy down to the football coach at Stanford, can't succeed in a libel suit unless they can show that the person criticizing them either knew that what it was saying was false, or at least actually had some inner doubt about whether it was true. Now, that leaves a lot of leeway for reporting and criticism about the famous and the powerful. And sometimes it's unfair and sometimes it's false. But the Supreme Court said we have to tolerate that because of what it called, quote, the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open.
Oh, that's really interesting. First, I get the feeling we're going to be going back to 1798 again, now that Trump has already gone there with the Alien Enemies Act. I get the feeling that the term seditious libel might be invoked.
Well, luckily the Sedition Act is no longer in force, or I think otherwise some people would be in jail already.
That is true. Well, that does take us back to the Associated Press then, and its decision to call the Gulf of Mexico as it is, and not the Gulf of America. And so clearly Trump isn't somebody who likes what the Supreme Court calls, quote, uninhibited, robust, and wide open debate, especially around what you call various bodies of water. But is he then allowed to kick people out of the press pool for that reason?
Well, Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said, nobody has the right to go into the Oval Office and ask the President of the United States questions. And, that's true in one sense. And you or I can't walk into the White House and cross-examine Donald Trump. If I could, I got some questions for him. But the White House doesn't have to allow any reporters into the Oval. Trump could, if he chose, do business without ever speaking to a reporter at all. There's no requirement that he do so. But once a president decides to allow reporters into the Oval, there are some choices that president cannot make. And that leads to another important press freedom concept, First Amendment retaliation. There are a lot of laws on the books. Most of them have nothing to do with free press or free speech. Retaliation occurs when the government enforces one of those neutral laws against someone who has criticized it because of the criticism. Now, say you write a letter to the editor criticizing the county sheriff. The next day, sheriff deputies show up at your house, write you a ticket for not sweeping the sidewalk. You probably didn't sweep the sidewalk, and there's nothing wrong with a clean sidewalk law. It's not, as we say, aimed at speech. But when it is used to intimidate or punish a speaker or a news outlet for what it has said, that retaliation violates the First Amendment. So move forward. Trump tells everybody to call it the Gulf of America because he says so. And just as an aside, I'm not aware of any law giving the president the unilateral power to rename international waters. But the AP says, thanks all the same, but Gulf of Mexico has worked pretty well since 1552. We'll stick with it for now. And then, hey, presto, the White House excludes them from the Oval. So Caroline Leavitt is right. The AP has no right to enter the White House. But like any other news organization or anyone else, it does have a right not to be kept out of the White House just because the president doesn't like the things it says. That's First Amendment retaliation.
Now, how confident are you that the current Supreme Court is going to uphold the current understanding of the law in the way that you've described it? Are there justices on the court who would overturn some of the longstanding precedents you've cited on what governments can or can't do to restrain the press?
Well, the key concepts of press freedom are all under assault in the Trump era. Trump has been outspoken in his desire to bring back something that looks a lot like seditious libel. And some conservative justices on the Supreme Court have suggested getting rid of the actual malice rule, which would open both the press and ordinary citizens to massive lawsuits for defamation. Now, so far, the court's majority has not seemed interested in this crusade. The court turned down a petition from Steve Wynn, a Republican casino magnate, asking them to make it easier for him to sue the Associated Press. AP had reported that 2 complaints against him had been filed with police for sexual misconduct. He asked the court to overturn the actual malice rule. The court declined his petition and actually did not even request a response from the AP, which suggests that this is a fight that justices don't want to get into at this moment. But there's a good deal of energy in the conservative legal movement to cut back on a lot of areas of press freedom and make it easier to sue individuals and media. And from immigration arrests of political activists to threats against critical news media, Trump has threatened and, in some cases, already carried out blatant First Amendment retaliation.
So all these settlements that we've seen in the news by CBS News around 60 Minutes, for instance, and other quote unquote defamation cases that Trump has brought against various news outlets for critical things that they've said. How do you read the impact of these settlements on kind of our understanding of what First Amendment means? Is the press undermining its own case by agreeing to settle on those terms? Should they be going to court to fight this stuff? Like what would your advice be to outlets who are faced with a lawsuit from the Trump administration about something as banal maybe as the Gulf of Mexico or something more serious?
Well, as a former reporter for an AP member newspaper, I'm awfully glad to note that the AP has told the president that it's going to call the Gulf of Mexico whatever it wants and that it will see him in court. I think in some ways the most ominous development of the past few months has been the number of institutions that have very good defenses under the First Amendment against threats by the Trump administration, but which fold their cards because they are either politically intimidated or they don't want to spend the money required. And we've seen law firms who said, well, some of our clients don't want us to get into a conflict with the administration, so we will agree not to represent clients that they don't like, and we will agree to give money to causes that the president favors. This is a very ominous development because the First Amendment doesn't execute itself. We have to fight for it. Free speech is a battle that has to be fought in every generation. We saw that in the 60s when the government during the Vietnam War wanted to close down criticism. And we've seen it in the last year as Trump has just geared up to make it intolerable or too frightening to criticize or question anything that he's doing. Each of these First Amendment charged institutions, if you will, universities, law firms, news organizations, every one of them that folds its cards, every TV network that agrees to settle meaningless defamation suits against the president, every university that says, oh, yes, we will allow the government to censor what is taught in our classroom, they make the case of free speech harder to plead for the people who want to defend it. And it's a very alarming moment when you see the people who have the most to lose from an attack on free speech throwing up their hands and saying, we don't want any trouble. We don't want to argue. We don't want to fight back. That's not how the press clause was forged, and it could be how it is undone.
Yeah, it really does make you worry and wonder how difficult it's going to be to claw back all the
Yes.
rights that we've given up voluntarily
Yes,
as a
absolutely.
result of these settlements. Okay, well, to sum everything up, this is a super complicated topic and it is changing in real time. But if you had to distill this explanation of the First Amendment, the freedom of the press, rather, down to three takeaways, what do citizens need to know?
The concept of press freedom has a lot of facets, and I hope we will come back to it over time. It's one of the most complicated ideas in the First Amendment. But for right now, at an introductory level, I think it's important to remember three things. First, except in unusual cases, the government has no power of prior restraint. It cannot censor or restrain media in advance from reporting the news or criticizing its operations. Second, the First Amendment and the actual malice rule developed under it allow ordinary citizens or the media to criticize the powerful without being afraid of a ruinous libel suit. Third, if the targets of criticism, powerful people or institutions, try to use other laws to punish their critics, the doctrine of retaliation is an important safeguard of free speech and press. Now, it's no secret what's going on. Newspapers, broadcasters, web journalists, we're facing a constant withering barrage of attacks from Trump and his allies. And even some of the press's own institutions are sort of pulling back. The First Amendment and the Press Clause have weathered times like this before. There's no guarantee that they will again this time, but an informed public is the best protection the bulwark of liberty can have.
Well, thank you, Garrett. And looking forward to keeping an eye on this issue and talking again.
See you soon.
See you soon. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.